Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. You can find archive editions of the program online at youtube.com and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. It goes faster if you use the ampersand. My name is Joe Thomas, and our next guest in, quite honestly, perhaps not the most exciting, but perhaps the first time in my life it's been a hot-button topic, integrity of the vote. The manager of the Election Integrity Law Reform Initiative, senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. You just know him as Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing this morning, sir?
Joe, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
I thought it was interesting about all the things that were in the Inflation Act. I didn't see anything about voting in there. That was about the only thing they seem to have left out of the Inflation Act. But I figure they'll come back and get some things for it. We just chronicled with the Executive Order 14091 and some of the things that the secretaries of state across the country are trying to push back against the federal takeover of elections. I guess, they figure the average American thinks, oh, that'd be good. But that's only when their favorite party is in power, isn't it, Hans?
Oh, it is. Can you imagine the reaction of folks on the left, particularly people like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, if Donald Trump had issued an executive order telling everyone in the federal government to get involved in registering voters, in getting absentee ballots for them, in contracting out to third-party organizations on the right side of the political aisle to be able to come in and use government offices for the same thing. They would be screaming that he's trying to manipulate election results and intimidate people into voting for Republicans. But that's exactly what the Democrats are doing, and they think it's all just wonderful.
Oh, yeah, and I could hear them screaming about vote suppression and everything else. I did notice that some of this stuff is not, some of the agencies being asked or that were being asked were not, like, say, the places you'd go register to hunt or get a concealed carry permit, though, Hans. It seemed interesting that it was mostly the social welfare programs that were going to register voters.
Right, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Yes.
As people are being released from federal prisons.
Well, and we went through that a little bit with Terry McAuliffe years ago, back in the good old days when all we had to worry about was the governor just giving mass amnesty to paroled or released prisoners before ever vetting their status. And thousands of them just either were on the most wanted list, had gone missing, or had been reincarcerated. All this stuff, it seems like they're looking for the cheap headline and, making it seem like, oh, we're all for democracy. And when really they're violating the most basic tenets of the rule of law.
They are. That was particularly true with Terry McAuliffe in Virginia, because the Virginia law, Virginia Constitution made it clear that a governor can restore the ability of a felon to vote once he or she is out of prison, but it has to be done on an individual, case-by-case basis. In other words, they've got to review the record of that particular individual before they make that decision. And what did Terry McAuliffe do? He just issued a executive order from the governor just doing a mass amnesty. Mm-hmm. So it's just another sign of how, unfortunately, progressive politicians like him, they really don't care about the law.
And they also don't care about the actual integrity of the vote. They just want to make sure that the tally number next to their name or somebody in their political party's name is bigger than the tally number somewhere else. It doesn't matter if anyone's vote was actually suppressed. You and I talked about this the last time, Hans, that when non-citizens start voting, that is voter suppression. And if it was being done by Republicans, as you said earlier, there would be a hue and cry from Chuck Schumer on down.
There would, and we shouldn't forget that when Terry McAuliffe was the governor, and this really makes the point about that, when Terry McAuliffe was the governor, the Republican-controlled state legislature of Virginia actually passed a great statute that simply said that when residents were called for jury duty in our state courts, if it turned out they were excused because they were not a U.S. citizen, the jury, the courts had to send that information to the local county registrars so they could check to see if that person was registered to vote so they could take these non-citizens off the rolls. And what did Terry McAuliffe do? He vetoed that bill.
And then tried to claim credit for protecting people's rights to vote. I want to get into a deep bit of weeds here because I've often said this, that democracy as a tool to a republic built on the rule of law is handy. But if all you're going to do is democracy, I've compared it to some of the chemicals we use to fight cancer, some of the chemotherapy drugs. In managed and required dosages, they can help save lives. If you just took the whole thing at once, you'd probably wind up deceased, maybe still on the voter rolls. But that democracy is very much like that. If you just look at democracies, usually they end up in dictatorships, often wrapped in the raiment of democracy.
Yeah, that's been an unfortunate aspect of the history of mankind now for a very long time. And it's important to understand that we are a republic. We are a democratic republic, but we are not a pure democracy where there was a great slide I saw not too long ago in which they were talking about a pure democracy instead of a democratic republic is two wolves and a sheep voting on what they're going to have for lunch.
Yes, and it's true, and often it's one wolf because the two sheep had to work, and so they wind up voting on their own. And it really, I think that people misunderstand having a say. I've told people that if you really want to see, Pete Buttigieg and Andrew Yang both talked about democratic economies, democratic capitalism, when they were running for the Democratic Party nomination. I said, if you really want to see what democratic capitalism looks like, go to your average planning commission meeting when somebody wants to stop a project in their neighborhood and they get a dozen people who don't want the project, never minding whether there are thousands of people that would benefit from the project that didn't know they needed to show up there to vote. That's what democratic capitalism looks like, and really, the what we're trundling towards our elections.
Yeah, it's very true, and we have to do everything we can to ensure the security and integrity of the election process. One of the problems in Virginia, of course, is that Democrats, before they left the state legislature and the governor's office, at least the House side, passed a bill that is putting in same-day voter registration. It's effective right before the November election, and that is extremely dangerous. Being able to register and vote on Election Day before election officials have any time to actually check out and verify the authenticity of your registration is a big mistake. And anyone who thinks that's not an issue should look up Compton, California, where a judge just recently overturned a city council election in Compton. It was a city council race that was won by one vote. Ooh. And half a dozen individuals pleaded guilty to, guess what? Voter registration fraud. In other words, they claimed that they lived in Compton, even though they didn't, just so they could vote in that election. And that was more than enough to overturn an election won by one vote.
Hans von Spakovsky is on with us, election integrity, working very closely with us to make sure Virginia does as best we can, the Election Integrity Law Reform Initiative. Hans, you mentioned same-day voter registration. It's been ambiguous. I've asked a bunch of folks whether that's going to be a provisional ballot or not. It sounds like from what you were saying just before there that if I register to vote on Election Day, and who knows when that is, voting begins September 23rd here for the midterms in Virginia. Will that be an actual ballot, or is it provisional based on making sure at very least somebody else doesn't show up and vote under that same registration? I
have to admit, I don't know what is going on with that. in Virginia, and I don't know whether the State Board of Elections, which is supposed to, issue the guidance to county registrars on how to implement state laws. I don't know what they have done on this issue. The legislature may not be able to get rid of this before the November election, but at the very least, the State Board of Elections needs to tell county registrars everywhere, anyone engaging in same-day registration, immediately voting, needs to be given a provisional ballot so that there's enough time to check out the authenticity of their registration.
They did fix one thing, and when I heard about the same-day voter registration, I was very scared, and I've been told that they've taken away sort of the ambiguity of the identification process, that you do really need to show that you are who you say you are, because up until last year, there was a few years where you could just show up with an electric bill from the address you're claiming to be a resident of, and you could, as long as you were on the voter rolls, go vote in the name of that person. You didn't have to show an actual identification. They have tightened that up here in Virginia, haven't they, Hans?
Well, I think they have, but really what we need to have is a system where you can only vote with a photo ID, and that is not the situation in Virginia, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it'll have to be something that's going to get late. And I've asked this, and you and I have talked about this in the past. I'm still waiting for somebody from Mark Warner on down to show me somebody who actually walked up to a poll and said, "I'd like to vote," and was turned away. That wasn't already a conservative voter who was turned away because somebody had already voted in their name. But I'm talking about just somebody coming up and saying, I'd like to vote, and they weren't allowed to because they scream voter suppression. But I've never seen anyone who's been turned away that wasn't somebody who had already somebody vote in their name.
Yeah, no, that is part of this myth of voter suppression that folks on the left push in order to oppose election reforms. Look, Joe Biden even made that claim in his executive order that he issued, the one telling federal agencies to get involved in that. He claimed there was barriers to access at the polling places. That is total nonsense. There aren't any barriers to people going into polling places and voting across the country. In fact, we had one of the highest rates of turnout in a presidential election in 2020 than we've had in a very, very long time.
It sounds like the mischaracterization. The same thing happened in Georgia, where the law says you can't hand out water with a campaign, or you can't hand out anything with a campaign sticker on it. And they made it out like the new election law was going to keep people from getting a bottle of water on the line. Hans, how cruel is that? Well, no, they can have a bottle of water. It just can't say vote for candidate X on it.
Right. You don't want candidates going down the line where people are waiting in line to vote, giving them free food and other things in order to basically campaign and persuade them to vote for them. And in fact, that happened in Georgia. That was one of the reasons for this particular amendment to the law. Right. And, all the complaints about this in Georgia, I actually talked at one point, or I didn't talk, but I heard some state legislators in Georgia at a lecture or something, and they were saying, whose law they copied to put in that restriction? State of New York.
Of course. But that's amazing. I know there are political operatives out there listening to this program going, why didn't we think about that? Oh, my goodness. Hans, the president's executive order, the secretaries of state are pushing back against it.
Yes.
Does it open the door to more Zuckerberg organizations, getting involved, coming along to this federal agency? Let's say you're the Bureau of Land Management, and you're now tasked with voter registration, and you have nary enough time to, manage the 75% of the country that's under Bureau of Land Management control. So somebody comes along and says, "We've got some election lawyers here that we will hire. We will pay them to work out of your office if you just give us a desk somewhere, and we'll do all that for you," which is what we saw with the Center for Technology and Civic Life, and just makes that even more likely to happen?
Yes. In fact, the executive order signed by Biden in March of last year, in fact, directs federal agencies to open up their offices to third-party organizations to conduct voter registration and related activities. So which organizations do you think they're going to pick to do that?
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be liberal organizations that support Democrats, organizations like La Raza, Planned Parenthood, other organizations who go out and register voters. They try to find liberal Democratic voters to register.
Well, they're also not held to the same standard or scrutiny as a federal employee when it comes to what they can and can't do. Correct? I mean, you were talking about Hatch Act and things like that.
That is absolutely correct. And so this is a way to get around the Hatch Act because you're going to have these organizations. How are we going to monitor whether they're telling folks, here's a registration opportunity for you. And by the way, you really need to vote for Joe Biden's political party because, remember, you're here applying for government benefits. You want to be sure those get approved.
Yeah. Because you're not allowed to do that if you actually work for, the housing and urban development. But if you're just, an intern, quote unquote, working on behalf of these NGOs, when did this fetish for these NGOs really start to get underway? Because I almost wonder if we're not missing, let's get the NRA involved in this. Let's get the Virginia Citizens Defense League. If we can have all these NGOs from the left, should we, say, okay, well, then maybe we need some right-wing NGOs?
Yeah, that would be good, but that isn't going to happen in the Biden administration.
But given that, that we're looking at such an important issue, and the issue becomes whether or not the laws, whether they get followed or not, are going to be written by these people going forward. Where do we stand with these secretaries of state pushing back against it? Is there hope that we can avoid this kind of trouble through housing and urban development, all these other government agencies under this executive order? Because the joy of an executive order is we could just take it away at some point or another, and it is only that it's not law of the land. Hans, where do we stand on pushing back against it?
Well, as you mentioned, a week or so ago, more than a dozen secretaries of state protested by sending a letter to President Biden over this, in particular over his interference in the state's administration of elections, including the voter registration process. The other thing that needs to happen is they need to send letters to and send complaints to the inspector generals of all of these government agencies. The reason being that it's a violation of federal law, the Anti-Deficiency Act, for a federal employee in a federal agency to spend money on things that Congress has not appropriated the money for. And there's been no federal appropriation for government agencies, federal government agencies, to engage in voter registration, to request absentee ballots on behalf of the members of the public they deal with. And so any federal employee that's doing this, according to Biden's order, is breaking federal law. And the inspector generals are the ones who are responsible for investigating violations of this particular statute, the Anti-Deficiency Act, and that needs to be happening right now.
Do you presume we have a few left? They're not all, searching former presidents' houses or anything?
Yeah, I would hope so. I would hope this is something they would take seriously.
Well, no, and I mean that. I'm tongue-in-cheek about it because it seems like every time we say, but the law says this, President Biden and his team do the opposite and so say, okay, come get me. It's almost as if they have decided that they can make up the law as they go along.
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate problem with the Biden administration. We see that all the time. They just don't believe in the rule of law, and they're willing to ignore it if it interferes with their objectives and their goals.
But they also do things like in Wisconsin where they create the scenario, sometimes ignoring the state's constitutions. But here in Virginia, with the 45-day voting and the same-day voter registration, they rigged the system so that even trying to find somebody who's an illegitimate voter becomes almost impossible.
Yeah, they want that to prevented. They want to scare off people from in any way disputing that kind of thing, and that's also a real problem.
So, again, the Meese Center at heritage.org. Do you think, given all the attention, and you and I have done this a long time, Hans, I don't think there's ever been this much grassroots attention to vote integrity, that we'll have enough poll watchers to make sure that everything that we can is on the up and up here in Virginia, at very least in the midterms?
Yes. I've never seen this kind of effort going on to get people working in polls, to get poll watchers out, not just in Virginia, but in other states across the country. The 2020 election really woke people up, and the effort at the grassroots right now is very intense.
Well, thank you so much for your time and everything you do, and helping us out as well. VirginiaInstitute.org. There's links to all the stuff that we're trying to do to promote this volunteerism. I'd love to say these are paid jobs, but these are volunteer jobs. But at least you'll get to know that an election is on the up and up, and the candidates are all out trying to get as many folks as well for these elections. Hans, thank you for everything you do at heritage.org. Anything new in the pipeline you're working on before we let you go?
I should have a piece in the Washington Times very soon about the mistakes made by the Census Bureau that have distorted redistricting and the number of representatives each state has across the country. Overcounts,
undercounts, or just making up numbers?
Undercounts and overcounts.
We'll be looking for that, and I'm sure we'll have you back at that point. Hans von Spakovsky, thank you so much, sir, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Joe. Bye-bye.
And thank you for joining us here. For all of us at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy as the dog days of summer go on, thank you for everything you do to help us out. Find out more about how you can be involved. Maybe join the Tuesday Morning Group Coalition online at virginiainstitute.org. And for all of us here, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.